Good morning, everybody. Hi. My name is Jean Steiner, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you today to Grand Rounds and to introduce our speaker, Leslie Jamison. Today's Grand Rounds is sponsored by the CMHC Foundation, the department's Division of Public Psychiatry, and the Yale Poynter Fellowship. So why are all of these entities interested in having her speak in our community? Here are a few reasons. First, Ms. Jamison has impeccable credentials, having graduated magna cum laude with a BA from Harvard, received an MFA from the renowned Iowa Writers Workshop, and a PhD in English literature from Yale, and she has held teaching positions at Yale, Southern New Hampshire University, Columbia, the NYU School of Journalism, Wesleyan, the Iowa Writers Workshop, and the University of Iowa. That's just the first reason. She has published several books and dozens of essays in such publications as the New York Times, the New Yorker, and the Los Angeles Review of Books, which have garnered multiple awards. The third, and perhaps most salient reason for today, is that her recently published book is a beautifully written and gripping examination of both problematic alcohol use and recovery on her and on other writers and artists. This detailed and raw account of her lived experience and the meaning and importance of recovery stories is exactly what mental health professionals, trainees, people in recovery, and other advocates have come to respect and rely on as crucial data. She interweaves her personal narrative with an exploration of the lives and artistic work of historically prominent individuals, and also includes a deeply researched and colorful history of AA and the recovery movement. And the fourth reason, which is very cool, is that many of the events described in this book take place in New Haven, including a stint volunteering at a writers group right here at CMHC. Please join me in welcoming Leslie Jamison.
Thank you all for being here. It really is an honor to be speaking here in New Haven because it's a city that means a lot to me and is certainly a big part of my own recovery story. And as Jean mentioned, to be speaking specifically here at CMHC is truly wonderful. In my relatively early in my sobriety, I was involved in a writing group here and helping to facilitate it, and it was a really it was deeply meaningful to me and felt like yet another iteration of one of the truths that I really am exploring in this book, which is how the many ways in which storytelling can be transformative, and in which simply sharing personal narratives can be transformative, and that was happening in this building, in that room, so it's great to be back. So, as Jean mentioned, the book brings together my story with a number of other stories in order to look at certain questions like, what does addiction feel like on the inside? How do we tell stories about addiction? What are the consequences of those stories? And really, how do we tell stories about what it means to get better? So I'm going to start by reading a little bit from the book and then talk a little bit about how the book unfolds from there. The first time I ever felt it, the buzz, I was almost 13. I didn't vomit or black out or embarrass myself. I just loved it. I loved the crackle of champagne, its hot pine needles down my throat. We were celebrating my brother's college graduation, and I wore a long muslin dress that made me feel like a child until I felt something else. Initiated, a glow. The whole world stood accused. You never told me it felt this good. The first time I ever drank in secret, I was 15. My mom was out of town. My friends and I spread a blanket across living room hardwood and drank whatever we could find in the fridge, Chardonnay wedged between the orange juice and the mayonnaise. We were giddy from a sense of trespass. The first time I ever got high, I was smoking pot on a stranger's couch, my fingers dripping pool water as I dampened the joint with my grip. A friend of a friend had invited me to a swimming party. My hair smelled like chlorine and my body quivered against my damp bikini. Strange little animals blossomed through my elbows and shoulders where the parts of me bent and connected. I thought, what is this? And how can it keep being this? With a good feeling, it was always more, again, forever. The first time I ever drank with a boy, I let him put his hands under my shirt on the wooden balcony of a lifeguard station. Dark waves shushed the sand below our dangling feet. My first boyfriend, he liked to get high. He liked to get his cat high. We used to make out in his mother's minivan. He came to a family meal at my house fully wired on speed. So talkative, said my grandma, deeply smitten. At Disneyland, he broke open a plastic baggie of withered mushroom caps and started breathing fast and shallow in line for Big Thunder Mountain Railroad, sweating through his shirt, pawing at the orange rock frontier. If I had to say where my drinking began, which first time began it, I might say it started with my first blackout, or maybe the first time I sought blackout, the first time I wanted nothing more than to be absent from my own life. Maybe it started the first time I threw up from drinking, the first time I dreamed about drinking, the first time I lied about drinking, the first time I dreamed about lying about drinking, when the craving had gotten so deep there wasn't much of me that wasn't committed to either serving or fighting it. Maybe my drinking began with patterns rather than moments once I started drinking every day, which happened in Iowa City, where the drinking didn't seem dramatic and pronounced so much as encompassing and inevitable. There were so many ways and places to get drunk. The fiction bar in a smoky double-wide trailer with a stuffed fox head and a bunch of broken clocks, or the poetry bar down the street with its anemic cheeseburgers and glowing Schlitz ad, a scrolling electric landscape, the gurgling stream, the neon grassy banks, the flickering waterfall. I mashed the lime in my vodka tonic and glimpsed in the sweet spot between 2 drinks and 3, then 3 and 4, then 4 and 5, my life as something illuminated from the inside. There were parties at a place called the Farmhouse out in the cornfields past Friday fish fries at the American Legion. These were parties where poets wrestled in a kiddie pool full of jello and everyone's profiles looked beautiful in the crackling light of a mattress bonfire. Winters were cold enough to kill you. There were endless potlucks where older writers brought braised meats and younger writers brought plastic tubs of hummus, and everyone brought whiskey and everyone brought wine. Winter kept going. We kept drinking. Then it was spring. We kept drinking then, too. Sitting on a folding chair in a church basement, you face the question of how to begin. It has always been a hazard for me to speak at an AA meeting, a man named Charlie told a Cleveland AA meeting in 1959, because I knew that I could do better than other people. I really had a story to tell. I was more articulate, I could dramatize it, and I would really knock them dead. He explained the hazard like this. He'd gotten praised, he'd gotten proud, he'd gotten drunk. Now he was talking to a big crowd about how dangerous it was for him to talk to a big crowd. He was describing the perils of an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting to a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. He was being articulate about being articulate. He was dramatizing what the art of dramatizing had done to him. He said, "I think I got tired of being my own hero." 15 years later, he'd published a best-selling novel about alcoholism while sober, but he relapsed a few years after it became a bestseller. "I've written a book that's been called The Definitive Portrait of the Alcoholic," he told the group, "and it did me no good." It was only after 5 minutes of talking that Charlie finally thought to begin the way others began. "My name is Charles Jackson," he said, "and I'm an alcoholic." By coming back to the common refrain, he was reminding himself that commonality could be its own saving grace. "My story isn't much different from anyone's," he said. "It's the story of a man who was made a fool of by alcohol over and over and over, year after year after year, until finally the day came when I learned that I could not handle this alone." The first time I ever told the story of my drinking, I sat among other drinkers who no longer drank. Ours was a familiar scene: plastic folding chairs, styrofoam cups of coffee gone lukewarm, phone numbers exchanged. Before the meeting, I had imagined what might happen after it was done. People would compliment my story or the way I'd told it, and I'd demur, "Well, I'm a writer," shrugging, trying not to make too big a deal out of it. I'd have the Charlie Jackson problem, my humility imperiled by my storytelling prowess. I practiced note cards beforehand, though I didn't use them when I spoke because I didn't want to make it seem like I'd been practicing. It was after I'd gone through the part about my abortion and how much I'd been drinking while pregnant, after the part about the night I don't call, date rape, and the etiquette of reconstructing blackouts, after I'd gone through the talking points of my pain, which seemed like nothing compared to what the other people in that room had lived. It was somewhere in the muddled territory of sobriety, getting to the repetitions of apology or the physical mechanics of prayer, that an old man in a wheelchair sitting in the front row started shouting, "This is boring." We all knew him, this old man. He'd been instrumental in setting up a gay recovery community in our town back in the 70s, and now he was in the care of his much younger partner, a soft-spoken man who wheeled him faithfully to meetings where he shouted obscenities. "You dumb cunt," he'd called out once. Another time, he'd held my hand for our closing prayer and said, "Kiss me, wench." He was ill, losing the parts of his mind that filtered or restrained his speech, but he often sounded like our collective id, saying all the things that never got said aloud in meetings. "I don't care, this is tedious, I've heard this before." He was nasty and sour, and he'd also saved a lot of people's lives. Now he was bored. Other people at the meeting shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The woman sitting beside me touched my arm, a way of saying, "Don't stop." So I didn't. I kept going, stuttering, eyes hot, throat swollen, but this man had managed to tap veins of primal insecurity. My fear that my story wasn't good enough, or that I'd failed to tell it right, that I'd somehow failed at my dysfunction, failed to make it bad or bold or interesting enough, that recovery had flatlined my story past narrative repair. When I decided to write a book about recovery, I worried about all of these possible failures. I was wary of trotting out the tired tropes of the addictive spiral and wary of the tedious architecture and tawdry self-congratulation of a redemption story. It hurt. It got worse. I got better. Who cares? This is boring. When I told people I was writing a book about addiction and recovery, I often saw their eyes glaze. "Oh, that book," they seemed to say. "I've already read that book." I wanted to tell them that I was writing a book about that glazed look in their eyes, about the way an addiction story can make you think, "I've heard that story before you've even heard it." I wanted to tell them I was trying to write a book about the ways addiction is a hard story to tell, because addiction is always a story that has already been told, because it inevitably repeats itself, because it grinds down, ultimately, for everyone to the same demolished and reductive and recycled core: desire, use, repeat. In recovery, I found a community that resisted what I'd always been told about stories, that they had to be unique, suggesting instead that a story was most useful when it wasn't unique at all, when it understood itself as something that had been lived before and would be lived again. Our stories were valuable because of this redundancy, not despite it. Originality wasn't the ideal, and beauty wasn't the point. When I decided to write a book about recovery, I didn't want to make it singular. Nothing about recovery had been singular. I needed the first person plural because recovery had been about immersion in the lives of others. Finding the first person plural meant spending time in archives and interviews so I could write a book that might work like a meeting, that would place my story alongside the stories of others. I could not handle this alone. That had already been said. I wanted to say it again. I wanted to write a book that was honest about the grit and bliss and tedium of learning to live in this way, in chorus, without the numbing privacy of getting drunk. I wanted to find an articulation of freedom that didn't need scare quotes or lacquer, that didn't insist on distinction as the only mark of a story worth telling, that wondered why we took that truth to be self-evident or why I'd always taken it that way. If addiction stories run on the fuel of darkness, the hypnotic spiral of an ongoing, deepening crisis, then recovery is often seen as the narrative slack, the dull terrain of wellness, a tedious addendum to the riveting blaze. I wasn't immune. I'd always been enthralled by stories of wreckage. But I wanted to know if stories about getting better could ever be as compelling as stories about falling apart. I needed to believe they could. So when I wrote this book, I was motivated by a few driving intentions and curiosities. Over the course of about 8 years, I spent writing it. One is that I wanted to illuminate the paradox of addiction from the inside. I think there are many ways to describe the paradoxes of addiction, but one is why do people keep doing this thing that is corroding their lives? And I wanted to try to get at what does that experience feel like from the inside, both in terms of what it had felt like for me, but also invoking the language and the narratives of storytellers, writers who had tried to invoke that experience before me. So I wanted to use my own story to illuminate that mystery, but also to use the stories of others, to draw on other voices to illuminate that central paradox. And I also wanted to explore how storytelling itself, both in literary spheres and in recovery spheres, can help us understand addiction better, and not only how storytelling can help us understand addiction better, but how storytelling can help us kind of find liberation from addiction, which is the premise of 12-step fellowship-based recovery. So I wanted to look at how does that work? How does the telling of stories and the exchange of stories help to kind of loosen addiction's grip, and also to be real about the ways that it doesn't always work. So the stories that I bring together in this book aren't all stories of triumphant sobriety. They're ragged stories, and they're real about relapse, and they're real about the kind of cyclicality of how relapse works, and they're real about the fact that not everybody gets better in the same way, and not everybody gets better, period. I wanted the book to be honest about those things. I wanted to look at how recovery itself works and what telling the story of recovery might look like, by telling my own story of recovery, but also by looking at how other authors wrote from sobriety and recovery, and by interviewing a set of ordinary people. I put that in quotes because I don't really believe in the concept of ordinary people, but to see how they told the story of getting better. And my desire to tell these stories was part of my belief that every ordinary life has 1,000 stories in it worth telling. It's just about looking hard enough. And then as a kind of final layer, I wanted to examine how storytelling about addiction also affects policy and the public imagination, and to explore the political implications of the stories we tell about addiction. And part of this came from wanting to recognize essentially my own privilege as somebody like an upper middle class white woman who had always been allowed to kind of tell the story of my own addiction as a story of psychic suffering and interior complexity, and this is how much it hurt. And for many people, the story of their addiction is not allowed to be a story about suffering. It's turned into a story that demands punishment and creates villains. In a sense, every addiction story wants a villain, but America has never been able to decide whether addicts are victims or criminals, whether addiction is an illness or a crime. So we relieve the pressure of that cognitive dissonance with various divisions of psychic labor. Some addicts get pitied, others get blamed, and these divisions of psychic labor keep overlapping and evolving to suit our purposes. Alcoholics become tortured geniuses, drug addicts are deviant zombies, male drunks are thrilling, female drunks are bad moms, white addicts get their suffering witnessed, addicts of color get punished, celebrity addicts get tabloid headlines and posh rehab with equine therapy, poor addicts get hard time, someone carrying crack cocaine gets 5 years in prison, while someone driving drunk gets a night in jail, even though drunk driving kills more people every year than all illegal drugs combined. In her seminal account of mass incarceration, The New Jim Crow, legal scholar Michelle Alexander points out that many of these biases tell a much larger story about, quote, who is viewed as disposable, someone to be purged from the body politic, and who is not. They aren't incidental discrepancies between black and white addicts, drinkers, and drug users, but casualties of our need to vilify some bodies under the guise of protecting other ones. So the structure of the book, what Jean was alluding to, this kind of chorus of stories, is its own kind of argument. So there are points that I make in the content of the book itself, but the way I wanted the book to be composed of multiple stories is trying to make arguments of its own. So why was it important to me to tell all of these multiple stories? Part of it was the desire to create a book that could enact the kind of outward gaze of recovery itself. So for me, so much of what was powerful about recovery was, and fellowship-based recovery was, sort of looking outward from the claustrophobia of at least what my own addiction had become, which was to say my world got very small. My world became about 6 p.m. or 5 p.m. or 4 p.m. or whenever I was going to allow myself to take the first drink. And drinking itself became very much a process of shutting down and kind of turning inward. And fellowship-based recovery was all about showing up in a room and listening to other people's stories and listening to other people's lives. And I wanted to write a book that could enact that kind of outward vision in its very kind of DNA. And I also wanted to refuse what I thought of as the tyranny of a single storyline, or the implicit implication that all recovery should look a certain way, that it always follows a certain path. I wanted to surrender that idea of a single storyline and offer multiple storylines instead, to offer the kind of grace and permission of a chorus. So what are some of the stories that I tell? And what do these stories illuminate about addiction, recovery, storytelling, and the relationship between these things? So I tell the story of John Berryman, whose famous poems, the Dream Songs, summon intoxication with a kind of wild lyrical abandon. Something has been said for sobriety, he wrote in one, but very little. I tell the story of his attempts to stay sober, his stints in rehab, and the inspiration, the very different kind of inspiration he found in communing with other people in those healing communities. The novel he tried to write about these experiences, a novel he never managed to finish in the years before he relapsed and eventually committed suicide. I tell the story of Raymond Carver, who was a legendary drunk, and he was a legendary drunk particularly in Iowa City, which is the city where I learned to write and learned to drink. But he wrote some of the greatest, and I'd always thought of Carver as a kind of legendary drunk. And it was actually only a few years into reading his work that I even learned that he had gotten sober and spent the last decade of his life writing from that sobriety and writing from recovery. He wrote some of the greatest short stories of his career after he got sober, stories that found their traction in small moments of human connection, kindnesses exchanged between strangers, unextraordinary but deeply meaningful acts of daily survival, the kinds of connections he had witnessed in sobriety, an alternative to the ruptured relationships and disconnected silences of his earlier work. I tell the story of Jean Reese, who never got sober but managed to write beautifully from a life of unrepentant alcoholism. And I tell the story of George Kane, an African-American writer largely lost to obscurity today, whose 1970 novel Blues Child Baby not only effectively predicted Nixon's war on drugs a year before it began, but who managed to write a deeply self-aware account of heroin addiction without managing to overcome his own addiction in real life. I wanted to write a book that honored the ways in which storytelling can be an important part of recovery, but that also confessed sometimes telling the story of addiction isn't enough to save you from its grip. In examining these storytellers, who all tried to create narratives about addiction and recovery, I also kept coming back to the question, where does addiction come from? Not only what does it feel like, but also how do people navigating addiction tell the story of its origins? Many scientists prefer the phrase chemical dependence to terms like addiction or drug abuse. Once John Berryman started to identify as an alcoholic, he put it like this: we're all dependent people. Take our chemicals away, we have to find something else to depend on. But we're all dependent people, literally all of us, everyone who's alive, anyone human. So what primes you for a particular chemical dependence? You could say, I'm made of need. You could say, everyone is. You could say, my dad's absence for stretches of my childhood created need, or else inspired a certain relationship to men that kept creating need. You could say that my dad drank, and his sister drank, and their dad drank before they drank. You could point to the 20-year study that found chromosomal patterns in more than 2,255 families, quote, densely affected by alcoholism, and conclude that certain brains are more disposed to the neural adaptations that enable chemical dependence. You could say it all depends on how your neurons respond to the neuromodulators in your system, that it all depends on a complicated constellation of particularities in your genotype, and how these responses are treated or punished depends on the money you have and the color of your skin. And all of these explanations would be true, and none would be sufficient. What often seems truest is the confession of every explanation as partial and provisional, a possible shape to fill the empty space of why. Whenever I was drunk, I could tell you exactly why I drank. The reason was rarely the same river twice. Because I deserved relief from the burden of my own self-consciousness, the endless chatter of my inner monologues and self-appraisals, or else because there was something dark and broken at the core of me that I covered up with excess functionality, and getting drunk was the only way I could acknowledge it. Drinking was self-escape, or else it was self-encounter, depending on the story I was telling myself. But I was also interested in the ways these stories weren't sufficient. In the novel I was writing, there was no good reason that either of my characters was so sad. In early drafts, there were no explicit traumas in the narrative that produced their self-destructive impulses. The mystery of these impulses was what I wanted to explore, the possibility that you might damage yourself in order to figure out why you wanted to damage yourself, the way exhaling into cold air makes your breath visible. In so much of your writing, one boyfriend told me, there are so many hooks to hang the pain on, but no explanation of where the poison coat came from. He was right. It can seem dishonest to attach certain kinds of pain to the syllogisms of cause, to pretend you can source the fabric of the poison coat. That's part of why I love Charles Jackson's novel, The Lost Weekend, for its rejection of the idea that you could easily or automatically turn drinking into meaning. It insisted that you couldn't always trace the self-destruction back to a tidy psychological myth of origins. It had long since ceased to matter why, he wrote. You were a drunk. That's all there was to it. You drank, period. Jackson's account suggested that drinking was more mysterious than that, and maybe less noble, a wreckage less fully constituted by the grand profundities. In A Drunkard, a poem left unpublished in her lifetime, Elizabeth Bishop located the origins of her urge to drink in the aftermath of a fire she witnessed as a toddler. The sky was bright red. Everything was red, the speaker remembers. I was terribly thirsty, but Mama didn't hear me calling her. Mama was busy giving food and coffee to strangers whose homes had been destroyed in the fire. The next morning, sifting through the charred debris, the little girl picks up a woman's stocking. Put that down, her mother says. This moment of scolding is identified as the seed of a desire that will haunt the girl for years. But since that night, that day, that reprimand, I have suffered from abnormal thirst. I swear it's true, and by the age of 20 or 21, I had begun to drink and drink. I can't get enough. All this rings true to me, the idea that thirst might rise from an abiding longing for the one who would not come, that hunger becomes constitutional in the shadow of absence or departure. Compulsion might find its roots in reprimand from a sense of being scolded by the world or found wanting by it. But it's really the final lines of the poem that interest me most, not the ones that explain, but the ones suggesting that any definitive explanation would be futile. As you may have noticed, I'm half drunk now, and all I'm telling you may be a lie. One critic calls this ending to the poem a half-hearted disclaimer, but to me it's the point of the poem, the way it calls out the instability of any thesis statement about need and recognizes the desire for clear-cut causality as another powerful thirst. The drinking came from my mother's absence, from this moment, from this trauma. Instead, the poem withholds the clarity of that origins myth, suggesting that the drinking, I'm half drunk now, has invented its own domino trail of causes. Why do you drink? Berryman once asked himself in a note, then wrote, don't really answer. But he answered anyway, to animate boredom, calm down excitement, dull pain. He listed other reasons. Insecure grandiosity, self-destructive. I am just as great and as desperate as Dylan Thomas, Poe, etc., etc. Delusion. I need it for my art. Defiance. Fuck you. I can handle it. He didn't believe in any single reason. He believed in all of them and also none of them. Don't really answer. But what else could he do? Returning to his reasons was one of the things he kept doing in hopes that it would help him stop. Gabor Mate, a Vancouver clinician who spent almost a decade working with addicts on Vancouver's Skid Row, traces every addiction back to childhood trauma, drawing neat boundaries around its thrall like a chalk outline at a crime scene. In Grand Central Winter, Lee Stringer's memoir about his days as a homeless crack addict living in the subterranean tunnels of New York's Grand Central Station, Stringer frames the causes of his addiction as a 3-act play anchored by the death of his brother. He puts the whole thing in italics. Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. The form allows him to connect his addiction to his grief while still acknowledging the crafted nature of this connection, how it imposes its neat structure on a much messier root system of craving. Stories of addiction are full of this insistence that addiction can't be fully explained. It's a trope of the genre. I told him I drank a lot, Marguerite Duras writes, describing a young man she'd just met, that I'd been in hospital because of it and that I didn't know why I drank so much. As Jackson put it, the question of why stopped mattering a long time ago. In Junkie, William Burroughs anticipates the question. Why did you ever try narcotics? Why did you continue using it long enough to become an addict? But refuses to answer them. Junk wins by default. Most addicts, he writes, did not start using drugs for any reason they can remember. These refusals aren't statements of objective truth. They're descriptions of the texture of experience. In resisting definitive explanations, they testify to the way addiction creates its own momentum, its own logic, its own self-sustaining warp speed, the ways it can seem autonomous and untethered, born of itself. These refusals resist the simplicity of syllogism, any neat one-to-one correspondence between trauma and addiction, insisting that the self is always more opaque than we're prepared to imagine. There is no simple key to turn the lock of why. When I posed the question of why to Dr. Adam Kaplan, a psychiatrist at Johns Hopkins, he expressed frustration with the limited psychoanalytic accounts that held a monopoly on the medical establishment's ideas of addiction for much of the mid-20th century, bottle as breast. Dr. Kaplan wasn't dismissing the importance of childhood or the enduring desire for affection. He was simply resisting the cookie-cutter simplicity of a single predetermined psychological storyline, just as Stringer's italics, Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, questioned the origin story of his addiction even as he offered it. When Burroughs refuses to answer the question of why, he's also refusing the demands of respectability politics. He won't give the doctors, the ones who want to dissect him in order to heal him, exactly what they want. Burroughs doesn't want to be broken into explanations and reassembled into well-being. He wants to stand behind his subtitle, Unredeemed. The junkie was called Confessions of an Unredeemed Addict. The syllogisms of cause and effect dangle the prospect of transformation, but he's not interested in that redemption. So a lot of my book was driven by the desire to figure out, as I laid out at the beginning, kind of how to tell stories about getting better that are as compelling and as rich and as complicated as the stories that we tell about falling apart. And the dissertation that I wrote here at Yale in the English department was specifically looking at authors who had gotten sober and what their creativity had looked like in sobriety and in recovery. And I sort of look at a number of authors in relation to different kinds of recovery institutions. So I look at Charles Jackson in relation to Alcoholics Anonymous. I look at William Burroughs and a host of other writers in relation to this institution called the Narcotic Farm, which was a federal prison hospital opened in Kentucky outside of Lexington in 1935. And the Narcotic Farm was interesting because it was like kind of literally a institutional manifestation of America's inability to decide whether addiction was an illness or a crime. So they decided to create literally a prison hospital for addicts. And William Burroughs spent time there. His son spent time there. And I look at how writers were sort of pushing back against its rhetoric of rehabilitation, but also how many of the people who were at the Narcotic Farm wanted the things that it promised, even if they resisted the ways in which it tried to deliver them. And then I look at John Berryman and David Foster Wallace in relation to rehab and the kind of community of rehab and how that shaped their work. But in the context of this larger book that kind of draws on the research from my dissertation and puts it in conversation with my own life and a kind of larger cultural history, it's really important for me to recognize that in trying to figure out how to tell the story of getting better, it's not just an aesthetic question or a literary question. What do literary accounts of getting better look like? What are the literary possibilities of telling the story of getting better? How can the story of getting better be as compelling, as beautiful, as complicated and dynamic and alive as the story of falling apart? But it's also a question of policy and social imagination and inclusion. In the same way there are policy implications embedded in how we tell the story of addiction and whether we frame it as an illness, as a crime, how we understand it in relation to personal agency. There are also policy implications in how we tell the story of recovery and getting better. And for me, it's important not to understand the story of recovery in limited or reductive terms. So although my book devotes much of its attention to Alcoholics Anonymous, a singularly impactful grassroots organization that has become an important part of sobriety for many people, it also recognizes that 12-step recovery isn't the only approach to substance dependence, and it's certainly not sufficient or even helpful for everyone. Any ethically responsible vision of treatment needs to include a much broader array of options, including medications like buprenorphine and methadone, as well as therapeutic approaches, including cognitive behavioral therapy, motivational enhancement therapy, which is all another way of saying, and this is how it connects back to my book, we need to figure out how to tell a broader array of stories about what recovery looks like. The stories we tell about addiction have always had a deep impact on legal policy and social opinion. The war on drugs is only the most radical demonstration of this. And when it comes to narratives of addiction, it can be tempting to focus on a single kind of happy ending, enduring abstinence. But abstinence is a limited definition of healing that threatens to ignore the necessary work of harm reduction. Clean needle programs, supervised injection sites, over-the-counter distribution of Narcan, and medical care for addicts. Accepting other storylines besides abstinence means accepting the fact that not every addiction story is going to follow the same arc, and pursuing policy measures that don't act as if abstinence is the only outcome we can imagine seeking. As Gabor Mate told journalist Sarah Resnick, abstinence is not just a model you can force on everybody. There's nothing wrong with it for those for whom it works. But when it comes to drug treatment, there's an assumption that one size fits all, and if you're going to wash your hands of people who can't go the abstinence route, then you're giving up. Supporting harm reduction involves acknowledging that sobriety might not come immediately or even eventually for everyone, that it might not be the triumphant concluding chapter at the end of every addiction story. And even when it is, it's never a conclusion and it's never easy. When we resist the tyranny of abstinence, the notion that abstinence has a monopoly on meaningful healing, we allow ourselves to recognize that there are still lives that can be saved, still sick people who can be brought to better health. Resisting the tyranny of abstinence involves granting entry to a wider variety of storylines. When I spoke about the process of writing my book with a writer named Lucas Mann, who also happens to be a personal friend, in addition to being a journalist who has written extensively about addiction, he told me that I probably had a lot more faith in 12-step recovery than he did. He'd seen firsthand the damage it could do. He told me he knew a guy who'd gotten kicked out of a methadone maintenance program for having dirty urine. Was that treatment? To Lucas, it seemed like the draconian outgrowth of an abstinence-only culture that could not make room for the messier story of a relapse. The man died of an overdose 6 weeks after getting kicked out of the program. Lucas was talking about his brother. Every addict, though, is someone's brother, or someone's son, or someone's lover, or someone's father, or all of the above, or none of the above and all alone, but always, still, someone in the midst of a valuable human life. Thank you. So I think we'll do some questions if people have them. It's always my favorite part, so I get to listen to other people's voices. Yeah.
So I'm interested in the idea, you used the word craving and urge, and I'm curious if you have this is something we want to capture as researchers and to maybe address with new treatments. And I wonder, what do you think are the words that best capture that when you're in meetings? What are the words they use?
Yeah. I mean, craving, longing, I think that sense of something, I think they're often the words that feel most resonant are the words, at least to speak for myself, that capture something that seems to be coming from a place that's like very deeply embedded inside of you, that's sort of knitted into the fiber of your bones and muscles and feels kind of inextricable. And I think often for me, the craving and the longing is attached to the flip side of an intense kind of anxiety about, well, what would life look like without this thing? So for me, when I was still drinking, even when the drinking had started to feel claustrophobic and I felt kind of ashamed by how obsessed I was with thinking about drinking, and it felt like my whole life revolved around when it was going to happen and how it was going to happen, and I felt like just ashamed that I was like carrying around all of that obsessive anxiety every day. Even when it had started to feel bad in all of those ways, I think part of what kept me inside of it was this fear of like, what would life look like without this thing? So I'm trying to imagine just day after day after day without that horizon of relief, night after night after night as just a kind of flat, wide awake, sober space. I think that was terrifying. And so I think that the the longing or the craving was always fueled by that counterpoint of like, what would life be like without this thing? And I guess one other piece of language that always rang true for me when I heard it was this idea of drinking as kind of filling a lack. And, you know, I remember somebody once describing themselves as kind of like a bucket with a hole in it. So you could take in, you know, as much affirmation or as much love as you wanted, but it always felt like it was just leaking out of the bottom of the bucket, and that drinking was kind of a way to keep bringing more and more into this bucket that was never really going to hold it. And that idea of kind of both, that idea of this like essential lack inside that you could never quite fill was also really resonant language. So.
In the book, you speak about some of the cliched stories in AA, and I thought it was so interesting. I'd love you to talk more about that, about how cliches are something that in some way created distance for you, and then you developed a real appreciation for the humanity in that.
Yeah. So I think when I first went into recovery, cliches were a little bit of a tough pill for me to swallow. You know, many of them are kind of famous in a broader cultural context, like one day at a time, or you know, feelings aren't facts, or those kinds of statements. They felt reductive to me, and you know, I'd spent so much time in these literary environments that were all about trying to say something in the most complicated way possible, or to get at all of the complexity of experience. And you know, and the most shameful thing to be was like too simple about anything. One of the cliches in recovery that I had trouble with at first was keep it simple. But I think I really ended up embracing cliches for a couple of reasons. And one of them was that, you know, I realized that there was a lot of dodge work that was happening for me in complexity, that in coming up with, and you know, some of what I spoke about was related to this, and coming up with very complicated reasons for why I drank, or very complicated psychological explanations for why I drank. That complexity was also a way of evading certain simpler truths that, you know, I drank because I was afraid of what it would feel like not to drink, and I drank because I had like a deep craving to drink that was inside of me. And it's not to say that I no longer believe in complexity. I think human experience is incredibly complicated, and I'm all about finding language for that complexity. But that I realized that there was a way in which cliches could sometimes force me to confront things head on that complexity could kind of mask or give me a little bit of an escape route from. And so there was a self-confrontation that I think cliches really prompted in a useful way. And cliches were also a way of recognizing that no experience is singular or unique. So cliches become cliches because they feel true to a lot of different people. And so in that sense, realizing that a cliche, admitting that a cliche also applied to me, that it applied to my life, that it could be somehow useful, also became a way of recognizing my life shares so much in common with other people's lives. Like, I'm not the first person to experience pain in this way. I'm not the first person to be afraid of my own life in this way. And I think there was something about that recognition of shared experience that was also a really useful provocation in cliches. And then the last thing I'll say, which is related to that, is that I found cliches to be a very useful common language. So in recovery, you encounter a lot of people whose circumstances, whose lives might be quite different from your own. And sometimes it can be hard to speak across those differences. You know, to me, it would manifest as, you know, what could I possibly say to a woman who's living in a van with her son? Like, I've never lived in a van with my son. And I think there's something good about that humility. Like, I shouldn't pretend that I do understand what her experience is like. But it became a meaningful way to communicate across some of those divisions in life experience, to say this statement, you know, one day at a time, it might mean something different to me than it does to you, but it means something to both of us. And so it can become a kind of a piece of shared language in a really powerful way. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm really looking forward to reading the book. My question is about the interface between creativity and addictive personality, like in your both in your own experience and research on people who have been really good writers, David Foster Wallace, but also have this tendency towards addiction, and I'm wondering if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah. So, yeah, they're kind of like different stages, at least in my own evolving understanding of that relationship. And I think when I was younger, when I showed up at the Iowa Writers Workshop and I was 21 years old and I was doing a lot of drinking and reading the work of writers who had done a lot of drinking there beforehand, I started to develop this kind of mythic understanding of the relationship between drinking and creativity that had to do with this sense that both drinking to excess or using, different kinds of substances to excess and the creative impulse, that they both they were both signs of a kind of deep darkness inside, this communion with kind of like suffering and psychic pain and psychic complexity as manifest in psychic pain, and so that you experience like what I call in the book like extreme interior weather, and that extreme interior weather makes you want to drink and it makes you want to write. And I wasn't the first person to kind of think about the connection in those terms. There was one of the most kind of fascinating documents I encountered in my research was this 1968 profile of John Berryman that ran in Life magazine called Whiskey and Ink. It kind of offered this vision of Jerry Berryman as this like rogue drunk genius. It had a picture of him in a Dublin pub with all of these like empty pints around him, and and it said whiskey and ink, these are the two fluids that John Berryman needs to survive. And the idea was that he had a kind of singular vision that brought him into contact with these like very difficult truths about mortality and human pain, and a lot of his writing also looked back towards his father, who had committed suicide when Berryman was young, and that kind of primal trauma, but that the same kind of powerful communion with these painful truths that generated his writing also created the need to drink, and that the drinking was a way he kind of survived his contact with those truths. And that was a pretty limited portrait of, I think, what alcohol was doing for Berryman and to Berryman, and it wasn't ultimately really helping him survive that well at all. But that was yet another manifestation of sort of understanding the relationship between addiction and creativity in a certain way. And I think, as I was getting sober and in early sobriety, I went on the other end of the pendulum swing and sort of wanted to say, those are all myths. There's no connection between addiction and sobriety. It's this like ludicrous idea we have of the addict genius. And I, was on this quest to find like the fruits of sober creativity instead. And I kind of wanted to write a book that was just like demolishing this myth of the addict genius. And I think, in the course of writing the book, I sort of came to someplace in between, which is to say, I think there are real connections between what might produce the urge to drink or to use and what might produce the urge to write, that both can be responses to pain. But that it's certainly a delusion to think that the sort of experience of pain or the experience of addiction or the kind of extreme interior weather that might produce the addictive personality, that those states of being or states of character somehow have some monopoly on the creative impulse. And so I guess I came to some place that was like, well, creativity can happen in 1,000 different ways, and sometimes it's happening inside of addiction or alongside addiction, but it can also happen from these states of wellness that we might be more tempted to think of as kind of flat lines or tedious terrain. And in my own life, I think there are kind of noble philosophical answers to what happened to my creativity once I got sober, and there are also really simple physical answers to that question, which is like I found it a lot easier to wake up and write when I wasn't like incredibly hungover, or when I wasn't trying to figure out how to write another intricate apology note to my partner for whatever I had said drunk the night before. Like there were ways that life became a bit less cluttered once I wasn't drinking to excess all the time, that actually helped me connect in a different way to the creative impulse. And I also write a bit about how this was sort of specific to my own life. I'm not necessarily sure it's a pattern, but my writing sort of started to involve different kinds of methods after I got sober. So I started to do a lot more interviewing and a lot more kind of looking at other lives and trying to bring them into conversation with my own, and that hadn't really been a part of my work before recovery. So I think there was a way in which I sort of, my gaze changed a little bit through that process. Yeah.
What was the best thing that your support system did to help you when you were going through like trying to get sober, or like what would you recommend to people who are trying to like support their loved ones who are trying to get sober?
Yeah. So I would say like two things. One is like a particular moment that's coming to mind when I was going to say I got sober twice. I really tried to get sober more times than that, but I tried to stop drinking several times just on my own, and then did stop drinking by going into recovery and joining a fellowship, but then kind of had a major relapse and then came back into recovery. And that second time in recovery, pretty early on, I moved cities and, was once again starting to entertain the kinds of thoughts that had led to my first relapse, which were, well, maybe I can drink more responsibly this time. Like maybe I can make it work. Maybe I don't need to stop drinking entirely. Like I miss it so much. Like here's, I would construct this sort of idealized vision of drinking in my mind and then convince myself that I could get back to it. And I remember telling my partner that at a certain point, I think maybe I really can drink. I just need to figure out how to do it better. And at that point, he had heard me, declare that I was an alcoholic several times, stop drinking several times, start drinking several times, be in recovery for 9 months, convince him, myself, everyone around me I could do it better, drink again, go back into recovery again. I mean, so we've been through the back and forth many times. But he didn't say, that's a silly thing to think, or, well, you told me that a year ago and look how that turned out. He just said, he just asked me like, when was the last time that you went to a meeting? And I was like, well, it has been about 3 weeks. And he was like, just try going to a meeting and then see how you feel after that. And again, that's not to say that the answer is always go to a meeting, but that his response was not, I think you need to do this, or I think you should do that. It was more a response of like, well, check in with yourself about this thing. And in that particular instance, like check in with this community that has been really meaningful with you about this thing, and then just like see what you think after that. And I think there was something really powerful about, rather than trying to argue with me about what I did or didn't need, to sort of invoke the things that I had been trying to do to stay sober and to try to reconnect me with those things instead. And then the second thing I would say is just, for people who are part of a support system for somebody who's struggling with addiction, I would just always say, like, recognize that taking care of yourself and your own needs is a really, really important part of that process, because nobody can survive as part of a support system if they're not taking care of themselves. And that care can involve drawing boundaries where you need to draw boundaries. It can involve letting go of the idea that you can totally shape somebody else's destiny and sort of relieving yourself of that responsibility. And sometimes those can feel like distancing measures, but I think in a long-term way, they're sustainable. They're structures that allow a relationship to be sustainable rather than kind of giving everything and depleting yourself completely.
Your comments have brushed up a couple times against the issue of suicide, and David Foster Wallace was the example we were just reminded of, and others. And you mentioned others who we can all think of. And thinking about that in conjunction with addiction and in conjunction with narrative stories.
Yeah.
There's one sense in which suicide is sometimes the denouement of a tragic story. But there's another sense in which it could be the failure of imagination, of narrative. There aren't enough narratives to think about how to go forward, and in that vacuum, what else is there to do? And I wondered if you had any comments on that, and if your idea about trying to build a broader universe of narratives that might be available might be therapeutic and help people imagine ways forward in those moments.
Yeah, I mean, I think that feels very compelling to me, that idea of wanting to offer people who are in that place or approaching that place sort of more narratives about what things might look like going forward. I mean, one thing that has always struck me about David Foster Wallace's suicide is how many different stories people have wanted to tell about why he committed suicide, and that he committed suicide because he couldn't he couldn't kind of imagine the next aesthetic step he wanted to take, that he committed suicide because he'd sort of depleted his own creative self, that he committed suicide because he lost faith in sobriety, and even that desire to sort of reckon with suicide by constructing all these stories about it seemed both very intuitive and very human to me, but also maybe it was trying to impose a kind of conceptual apparatus onto his suicide that actually seemed like it maybe those things felt true to him, but it also seems like there were some real chemical reasons for what was happening with him, and that he had recently switched medications, and so I was also I felt wary of sometimes I guess thinking about things in narrative to the exclusion of certain kinds of physical realities too. This felt important to recognize, but yeah, I mean, I absolutely feel before he committed suicide, the semester before he committed suicide, John Berryman was teaching a class at the University of Minnesota called The Novel as Wisdom Work. And I don't know, I spent a long time in his archives trying to find the syllabus to that class because I wanted to know what novels John Berryman looked to for their wisdom work. But I've always thought, just from that title, that he was seeking stories that were going to help him figure out how to survive, and that was part of what he couldn't quite manage to do. He couldn't quite manage to finish his novel of recovery. He couldn't quite manage to kind of trust or have faith in those stories. And so I love that idea about that kind of therapeutic approaches could involve that work of figuring out how to tell the story of what your life might look like going forward. I'm not a clinician, and I don't work with people in that sense who are in that space, but in the context of my own life and the ways in which depression has often felt to me like a state where it's kind of impossible to imagine one's life as an interesting story, or a story that you particularly want to be inside of. Thinking about how to help people kind of come back into their lives as stories that they want to keep living feels very powerful to me.
Many of the writers that you reference are men.
Yeah.
And early on in your talk, you talked about being in this meeting and being called these very negative words. I'm wondering if you could speak to both the process of writing the book as well as going through the process of recovery as a woman, when these stories aren't often the ones that are available for others to read or to experience and get help from.
Yeah, so a lot of the stories in my book are stories about men, and at a certain point I did really step back and say, what does it mean that when I was young, so many of the literary icons that I worshipped were men, and that really felt like I kind of wanted entry into this boys' club of these drunk geniuses, and it made me think about part of why Jean Reese became a very important story in my book, even though her story is very much not a story of recovery. Although there were, I think, aspects of her that crave very deeply some of the things that happen in recovery. I think she craved community very deeply, and I think she had impulses towards self-interrogation that actually look remarkably like what you might find in recovery. She has, Jean Reese produced this document at one point called The Trial of Jean Reese, where she literally imagines herself in a kind of a courtroom trial, and I was struck by how much it looked like a kind of a fourth step, what recovery calls a fourth step, and a sort of self-inventory. And so part of why I felt like Jean Reese was an important part of this story was that I was interested in how kind of the female drunk is often seen differently than the male drunk. And so, even Jean Reese's biographer called her one of the greatest self-pity artists of the 20th century. And this was somebody who'd spent years engaging with Reese's work, presumably because she found it worthwhile. But there was still something about Reese's drinking that struck her as a kind of like a manifestation of self-pity. And I really, I saw that certain patterns over and over again, that like female drunks were more likely to be narrated as kind of failures at caregiving. And you can see that like, with how a literary author like Jean Reese was perceived as this kind of histrionic, self-centered, self-pitying, bad mom. But you can also see it in other cultural narratives. So like the media construction of the crack mother in the late 80s was very much about framing the female addict in terms of her failure to be an adequate caregiver. And it was sort of a radical misrepresentation of the science, like in service of that idea. So I definitely kind of tackle some of those ideas in the book, like how are male addictions and female addictions how do they lend themselves to different narratives? And some of the stories in the book that are not the stories of famous authors, but the stories of ordinary people in recovery, are also looking at how addictions, what sort of course they run through women's lives as well. But I'd say in my own experience of recovery, I mean, gender was present in all of those spaces and sometimes in complicated ways, but that I also found kind of extraordinary solidarity and hope and fellowship and communion in the stories of women I met through recovery. So that also felt like a very powerful vein of connection.
One last question?
Yeah, I guess I've got a question about, when you've gone to meetings, for example, the 12-step meetings, do you find that people who are more facile with language are recover in different ways than those people who are less facile?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say probably everybody comes to recovery with their own set of particular challenges and facilities maybe as well, but that I think sometimes, people who come into recovery with a lot of like self-consciousness and verbal facility, and that there's probably a kind of fuel in that because you might be naturally predisposed to storytelling, and so the ways that storytelling can be sort of helpful and saving in recovery is like at your fingertips. But I also think there are real challenges. I think it's easier sometimes when you're more facile with language, like it's easier to convince yourself you can like figure something out on your own, or easier to feel like you've got everything worked out, to want to kind of control everything in a way that I think can also really be like an obstacle. So I think that in my own experience of recovery, I certainly did not feel like the most articulate people in the room were the ones who had the best recovery or were recovering best. I mean, and in terms of what I learned from people I encountered in recovery, I mean, like, it might sound cheesy to say, but I felt like I learned something from like literally every single person I encountered, and that it often had very little to do with how beautifully they used words. So.